overwhelmingly, like 96+% of the time, when there's an admissibility challenge to DTI in courts across the country, courts have ruled that yes, it is admissible, and any criticisms of it go to the weight, not the admissibility.
TBI cases can feel like navigating uncharted territory. Your client's injury is real, but proving it? That's where the real challenge begins. If you've ever felt like you're missing crucial pieces of the puzzle, you're in the right place. Welcome to Winning the TBI Case, where Tom Crosley shares the insights he's gained from over 60 injury trials. Not just the victories, but the lessons learned along the way that make all the difference. This is practical wisdom from someone who's been in your shoes and found a path forward. Winning the TBI Case. Strategy, science, and storytelling. In this episode, Tom Crosley tackles the battleground issue that defines modern brain injury litigation, getting your diffusion tensor imaging evidence past aggressive defense challenges and in front of the jury. This is the episode that arms you with everything you need to defeat the no objective evidence defense once and for all.
Welcome back to Winning the TBI Case. I'm your host, Tom Crosley. And today I want to talk about diffusion tensor imaging, also known as DTI. And I want to teach a little bit of the science that is reshaping how we lawyers prove brain injury cases. So if you try mild TBI cases, you've probably heard of DTI. Maybe you've even used it. But a lot of lawyers still have only a fuzzy idea of what it is and how it actually helps us to prove a case, even when the CT or the standard MRI come back as normal. So in this episode, I'm going to focus on what is DTI in plain English, what does it measure in the brain, what does the scientific literature say about mild TBI and diffusion tensor imaging, and how does DTI fit into the proof of a mild TBI in litigation. So let's start with the basics. DTI is not a separate machine. It is a way of running an MRI and processing the data so that you can look at the white matter wiring of the brain. So let's think about how the brain is built. The gray matter is where the processing happens. Think of the gray matter as the cities. The white matter is the network of fiber tracks, the highways, that lets those cities talk to each other. A conventional MRI gives you still photographs of the cities and the landscape. It shows big lesions, hemorrhages, tumors, gross structural anatomy. But DTI goes a level deeper, and it asks, is the wiring intact? Or has the wiring been stretched, frayed, torn, or damaged? And so it does that by looking at how water molecules move along the brain's white matter. In healthy, tightly bundled fibers, water prefers to move along the length of the fiber. In injured or disorganized fibers, that directional movement breaks down and the water moves more randomly. An analogy I have often given is imagine a garden hose. And that garden hose is going to represent a white matter axonal tract within the brain. If the garden hose is long and straight and stretched out and normally functioning, water flows through it in a normal, predictable pattern. If that garden hose is torn, damaged, kinked, stretched, then the water flows through that garden hose in a disrupted manner. And you can compare normal versus disrupted, and you can draw conclusions from it. On a more microscopic scale, that's essentially what is happening with DTI. There might be a neuroradiologist out there that says my explanation is too simple, but I think it works, and I've certainly taught it to juries that way. So DTI turns this motion or movement of water molecules along axons, it turns it into a number called fractional anisotropy. FA is what they call it. High FA means water is moving in an ordinary, orderly, directional way. It's healthy wiring. Lower FA means the movement of water molecules is more random. It means the wiring is disrupted. It means the function isn't normal. And so when you see reduced FA in specific white matter fiber tracts in the brain, that is a red flag for traumatic axonal injury. That's the microscopic shearing and stretching and tearing of axons that happens in many TBIs, especially with rotational forces or acceleration-deceleration type injuries that are all too common in motor vehicle crashes. So in lawyer language, when we explain it to a jury, I would say DTI is a way to measure whether the brain's wiring has been damaged. It's looking for frayed cables within the wiring. So why does DTI matter in mild TBI cases? And why do we care so much about it? I think the best answer is that mild TBI cases live in that frustrating space where the CT scan is normal. The standard MRI is normal, but the client is clearly not the same person. There's something going on, and the defense keeps saying, hey, there's no objective evidence of brain injury. Well, we have to remember, traumatic axonal injury is often microscopic. It doesn't show up as a big white spot or a dark lesion on a routine MRI, but it can absolutely disrupt how the brain functions from day to day. And think about the NFL CTE cases when they were all first diagnosed. It was always on autopsy after death with slides and a microscope. These were changes in brains that were affecting behavior, but couldn't be visualized in vivo. So we know that microscopic changes to the brain can occur at a level below our machinery to detect, and we know that can result in poor outcomes and poor function. So back to DTI. DTI gives you a way to visualize those microscopic changes in the white matter tracts. It gives you a way to measure them using FA and other types of computer-based metrics. It gives you a way to map those changes to specific cognitive functions. Let me give you an example. The corpus callosum, the information superhighway that connects the two halves of the brain. That's the big bridge between the two hemispheres. Damage there can line up with processing speed problems, with multitasking problems. Frontal white matter tracts, those support executive function, planning, judgment, impulse control. Temporal and limbic connections tied to memory and emotion. And so the research shows that in many mild TBI patients with persistent symptoms, DTI finds reduced FA in exactly these kind of tracts. So those changes are associated with problems in attention, memory, processing speed, and executive function. In other words, for we trial lawyers, DTI helps turn the invisible injury into something you can see and quantify. And more importantly, something your jury can see. Because we all know the old adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So what does the science say in broad strokes when it comes to DTI? I'm not going to drag you through every study, but there are a few big picture points that are useful to know when you're talking to experts, talking to judges, or talking to juries. Number one, DTI is sensitive to white matter disruption. Multiple studies have shown that DTI can detect microstructural white matter changes even when conventional MRI is completely normal. That is especially true in mild TBI and concussion cases, where the main injury is to the axons rather than to the gray matter. Number two, DTI findings correlate with symptoms and testing. Across many studies and papers, you will see the same pattern. Patients with mild TBI and ongoing cognitive problems show reduced FA in certain tracts compared to healthy controls. The degree of FA reduction often tracks with worse neuropsychological scores and more severe post-concussion symptoms. So DTI isn't just finding random abnormalities, it's finding changes that you're going to try to match to the clinical picture, how the person thinks, feels, and functions. Another important thing for admissibility is how is DTI used outside of the courtroom? DTI is not just used for litigation. It's used outside the courtroom in multiple sclerosis to track white matter lesions and disease progression. It's used in dementia to study how white matter changes with neurodegeneration over time and age. It's used with Parkinson's and other movement disorders. It's used for pre-surgical planning for brain tumors to avoid critical fiber tracts. And that's just some of the uses. So that matters when somebody calls it experimental in your TBI case. Usually it's a defense expert who's going to say, the plaintiff's DTI, I don't really consider that because it's experimental, so we're not going to use that. That's really not true, and you're going to use its other non-litigation uses to help you show why this is an important tool for our jury to see, hear, and understand.
If you're finding value in today's episode, here's how you can take your TBI practice to the next level. Subscribe to our newsletter at crosleylaw.com/podcast for exclusive case studies, resources, and trial strategies you won't hear anywhere else. That's crosleylaw.com/podcast, or click the link in the show notes below. Don't just listen to the strategies, implement them.
Now, we rarely use DTI completely by itself to try to prove a TBI. It's part of the bigger picture. And so DTI by itself without any context is usually not enough to say, hey, this patient definitely has a TBI. White matter changes can sometimes be seen in other conditions or even in some normal populations. So you've really got to have a clinician put together the whole picture. Your DTI can help to corroborate why the deficits we see in this patient are most likely related to TBI. But you're not going to use it as your sole point of proof. So DTI, like many of our other advanced neuroimaging that we have available to us now, works best when it is a piece of the larger diagnostic picture, hopefully supported by multiple experts and multiple physicians. How do I use DTI in mild TBI litigation? Well, I use it as part of the medical story, just not the whole story. In a well-developed case, you'll typically see DTI play a role as follows. Physicians, neurologists, physiatrists, sometimes psychiatrists will make a TBI diagnosis using accepted clinical criteria, perhaps from the ACRM. I think I've done an episode on the American College of Rehab Medicine and its mild TBI definitions. But those definitions look at mechanism of injury, acute signs, usually in the first 24 hours, and the clinical course of that patient over the following days and weeks. Neuropsychologists will also document cognitive and emotional deficits with their testing. A DTI expert, typically a radiologist, will look at all of the imaging available. One of those scans is usually the DTI sequence run on MRI. And they'll interpret that DTI scan and say whether the pattern of white matter changes is consistent with the diagnosed TBI and whether it is consistent with deficits observed in testing or reported by peers. So DTI is not replacing the clinical workup. It is corroborating the clinical workup. It is adding objective structural data about what's going on inside the brain. The main way that I use DTI is to show objective injury when basic imaging is normal. It's used essentially to answer the defense theme, hey, there is no objective evidence of brain injury. Well, with DTI, we can now point to quantitative measurements showing certain tracts are abnormal. We can point to visual images comparing healthy tracts to our clients' disrupted tracts. We can cite to scientific literature, tying those abnormalities to the kinds of problems that our client has. So we're still relying on a clinician, a doctor, to make the diagnosis, but we now have an imaging study to back it up and to back up what all the other witnesses, before and after witnesses, people in the plaintiff's life are saying about how the person has changed. Another way we use DTI is to connect anatomy to function. So we can show what each highlighted abnormal tract is supposed to do in a normal brain. We can show how damage to that tract for this patient affects their day-to-day life. We can show how that lines up with our patient's specific complaints or documented deficits. For example, your neuroradiologist might testify about DTI, something like this. It's very visual, right? So he'd be pointing to the DTI scan. He'd be showing the damaged fiber tracts and be saying something like, these fibers help both halves of the brain share information quickly. When they're damaged, people often struggle with processing speed and multitasking. And here we see damage in this area of the brain, which is consistent with the reports from this patient that they're in a fog, that they have trouble finding words when they're speaking, that they're having difficulty with processing speed, that they're having more difficulty at work than they used to have doing a job that they used to know very well. So that's where DTI really becomes more than a number. It becomes a bridge between brain structure and you get to show a picture, right? You can point to the picture and show, that's abnormal. But it becomes a bridge between that structure and the lived experience of your plaintiff. The final way that I'm using DTI is as part of the explanation for long-term problems that our clients will increasingly have as they age with the brain injury that they've sustained. In chronic cases, even years after the injury, we can sometimes use DTI to show that white matter abnormalities still persist long after the acute injury phase. We can use it to support the idea that ongoing symptoms are not just psychological or used for secondary gain, but they're linked to enduring structural changes that aren't going to go away. And in some research, we might at least be able to explore the concept of post-traumatic neurodegeneration, where damaged fiber tracts slowly atrophy over time, leading to reduced brain volume. So in litigation, all of this can help explain why a client is still impaired years later, even after what the defense likes to call just a simple concussion. So let's sum it up this way. What do lawyers really need to remember about DTI? Number one, DTI looks at wiring, not just pictures. It's an advanced MRI technique that measures how water moves along white matter tracts in the brain. Changes in those measurements tell you whether the wiring has been disrupted. Number two, DTI is especially important in mild TBI. In the cases where CT and standard MRI are normal, but the person is clearly injured, DTI is one of the best tools we have for detecting traumatic axonal injury. Number three, the science shows real, meaningful associations between damaged fiber tracts, as visible on DTI, and function or cognitive problems or deficits that our patients may be having. Number four, DTI is not a standalone yes-no test. It is more a corroborating test as part of the overall picture. Number five, in litigation, DTI's role is to corroborate the existence of the injury objectively, can't be faked, and to help explain to a jury how this injury is real and structural. Doctors diagnose, the DTI neuroradiologist expert explains what the imaging shows and how it matches the diagnosis and the deficits, and together, these witnesses will turn an invisible injury into something the jury can see and understand. So if you keep all these points in mind, you'll have a clear mental model of what DTI is and why it matters in these type of cases. From there, you can work with your experts to build the kind of case that fairly presents the science to the judge and the jury. That's it for today's bulletin on DTI. We didn't get into the weeds on Dauber motions and arguments to exclude DTI or to get it into evidence, although we can get into that in another episode. I can tell you this, that overwhelmingly, like 96+% of the time, when there's an admissibility challenge to DTI in courts across the country, courts have ruled that yes, it is admissible, and any criticisms of it go to the weight, not the admissibility. So we may talk about that in a future admissibility of evidence episode, but just remember this. When used the right way, DTI is a powerful tool for showing that a mild TBI is anything but mild for your client. This has been Winning the TBI Case, Strategy, Science, and Storytelling. I'm Tom Crosley.
If today's episode helped you see your current case in a new light, share it with a colleague who's facing the same challenges in a case. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join our community of trial lawyers who refuse to settle for average results. This has been Winning the TBI Case, Strategy, Science, and Storytelling with Tom Crosley.